Happy Monday.
How's it going, Joe?
Good. How was your weekend?
It was good. It was one of those just kind of decompression weekends, honestly. I just needed to
Nice.
clean out a bunch of stuff in my apartment to feel good about my life. So pretty boring, but we'll get into some
Yeah,
other
you got
segments.
rid of the piles of shame.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I got rid
That's
of
awesome.
CDs. That's how old some of this stuff was. I still have some
Holy
CDs
cow.
that I had
CDs.
to throw away.
That's funny. Yeah, I was staying at this house in Bear Lake over the weekend and they had DVDs. I haven't seen those forever. But I guess if it works, it works. So,
Yeah, yeah. It's a matter of what's available on the streaming services, right? Like some of these movies you have to pay for, so why pay for it again? It's
right.
available. So
Yeah,
yeah, but still, it
exactly.
looks kind of weird to have your Blu-rays sitting around. It's like, what am I doing with these in 2020?
Yeah, yeah, it's so antiquated. Well, cool. Yeah. Today we want to talk about transitioning your data warehouse and some tips around that. So, what what are your thoughts on this, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you've followed this discussion at all, we're big fans of data warehousing in the cloud specifically, and one of the big appeals of cloud data warehousing is that it really transforms the conversation about what data warehouses can do. Moving from like a Teradata to a Redshift, for example, gives you way more capabilities and way more scalability. And so if you're thinking about making that kind of transition or maybe expanding your footprint, don't just think about lifting and shifting what you have. Think about the new possibilities on the new platform while you're doing that.
hmm Yeah, I would say lifting and shifting is one of the things that we come across quite a bit. Like the question, do I lift and shift or do I start over? Our response is typically if you, unless you have a really good reason to lift and shift, don't lift and shift. You're moving to a new data warehouse for a reason, and that new data warehouse probably has some very particular nuances that perhaps your old data warehouse won't be completely compatible with. Every data warehouse has its own way of doing stuff. So like lifting and shifting, um, in and of itself, we tend to shy away from that. Also, um, if you're moving, that sort of indicates that something's not working with the other one. So there's no sense in replicating your problems, uh, in your new data warehouse. So,
Yeah, yeah. So if you're a business and you're a going concern, then you have stakeholders, right? And they're going to need the data that's in the existing warehouse to move over to the new warehouse. But one thing you can look at is data that you're expending a lot of energy on in the current system that really isn't used very much. And so maybe that data doesn't get moved, at least not in its current form. You can kind of start winding down those tables and cutting off access and seeing who screams. And if no one's really consuming it, then don't go through the effort of moving it over to the new system.
hmm
I think the next thing you
yeah,
can do that is like, okay, so you have these consumers, but you can bring the data over in a new form. Maybe you can just rethink how some of these tables and schemas work as you're shifting over. Obviously,
yeah,
that makes it a little more challenging for your stakeholders, but at the same time, if you can show them a benefit like better scale and better performance, then hopefully you can bring them on board.
for sure. And you definitely, it's a time to rethink your data pipelines too.
Yeah,
I mean, I think we find that data warehouse problems are sometimes caused by inadequate data pipelines, and so starting fresh, I think is a great approach if you have the luxury to do that. If you don't, it's really a matter of prioritizing what's going to be the most important thing to start with first, developing a cadence around that, and then moving to the next priority after that. So we definitely don't advise doing everything at once either. There's
right.
a temptation that we're just going to move it all over right now and be done with it, and that's typically a recipe for getting overwhelmed and probably going over budget and over time.
Right,
So
right. People are just going to end up being unhappy. You want to set a reasonable cadence for yourself. That could be 1 to 2 years even. And in that time, you can move data over, you can keep your stakeholders happy. And again, you can kind of rebuild around a new vision for the new data warehouse, the capabilities that it offers in the
mhm.
process. Yeah.
Yeah,
At the
maybe
same
some
time, there's a
tips.
risk of being
Sorry,
stalled, right? Sorry, I talked over you. Go
no,
ahead.
don't worry about it. Now, what were you saying?
Oh, there's a risk of getting stalled too. And so you really need to watch out for that as well if you're doing a slow transition like that. We've all seen cases where companies have like 4 different data warehouses that different teams use. And there really is something to be said for trying to consolidate into a central location as much as possible.
Yeah, for sure. And in terms of prioritizing, I would say look at like what are the slowest, most critical reports right now that would benefit from moving over to a new data warehouse, and start with those first. Those are going to be your most high impact reports. And most BI tools, they can connect to multiple data warehouses. So, when that report's moved over to the new data warehouse, just point your Tableau or your Looker at this new data source, and and basically recreate the report, and everything's ported over. And that way, you're not missing anything, right? Like the new report's working a lot better, but then stakeholders still get the old reports from the old data warehouse. And eventually, as you keep working through this progression, and moving through reports and migrating them over and migrating tables and so forth, eventually you can make a cut over at some point. So
Right. And our typical strategy is actually to don't shut down the old data sources because you don't want to create a crisis, but cut off access. And then if someone really needs that data, you can turn it back on until they're really ready to move over, until the data in the new target warehouse is up to snuff, up to the spec that they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's going to be the tricky part too, is validating data, making sure that the new data warehouse is matches the old one. It's very well possible you might find mistakes in the old data warehouse too.
Almost always, right? Almost
Yeah.
always data problems in the existing warehouse, which makes validation tricky, right? Because are you really trying to replicate every detail of the problems in the old data? Probably not. And that's where you want to get the stakeholders involved in what the data validation process should actually look like.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of which, when you're porting data over and maybe refactoring your data pipelines, it might be a good idea to introduce new tools like Great Expectations, for example. So that allows you to, perform data quality checks, almost akin to unit tests for code, and that's pretty cool.
And
So,
DBT as well supports data build tools, supports similar functionality, where you can basically run a SQL query after you've run a transformation query to check that the data satisfies certain conditions.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, this should be a lot of fun. Migrations are always an adventure.
Right. But,
Sure,
make it an agile process, take advantage of the capabilities of the new warehouse, and then it can be more fun, right? One thing you find with traditional data warehouses is that a company signs a contract, I'm going to buy this many CPUs and this much storage. And so they're constantly fighting with those limits. And once you get into the cloud, of course, you want to control your spend, but it's a very flexible environment, which allows you to build out things much more quickly without thinking about those details, and then kind of go clean up the stuff that didn't work out afterward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the spend's a really key part too. You're moving towards an OpEx model, and so you really do need to be conscious of spend. I would suggest learning how every data warehouse has its own particular way of doing things, and so if you can learn the nuances of that data warehouse, and particularly with respect to its cost model, that allows you to optimize your queries, and downstream performance from there. It's kind of shocking sometimes when I meet people who haven't taken the time to understand the new data warehouse you're moving to and the way it wants you to do things. Definitely don't fight against what that system wants you to do. So.
Well, it's funny, in the traditional kind of DevOps world, I think there's this idea of performance engineering for on-prem systems, right? So I purchased this many web servers and this much CPU, and so I really need to engineer, say, my Java code so that it can handle maximum website load on that set of servers. And then eventually I'll have another buy new hardware, try to estimate, and then try to make my new code fit within those performance constraints. In the cloud, I refer to the process you need to replace this with as cost engineering. So you can buy any number of servers, you can scale up and down over time. In fact, you're encouraged to treat services as ephemeral and scale them up and down, but try to analyze the costs and see where you can save money in a reasonable way without expending a huge number of DBA or developer hours in the process. And so that's exactly what you're referring to. Like how can you make your processes as cost efficient as possible over the long term while still getting lots of value out of your system?
Right, that's a really good point, because it's not just migrating data over to a new technology, but it's refactoring your opportunity costs and how you want to spend that as well. There's a total cost of ownership, and then there's total opportunity cost of ownership. And by moving to a new system, suddenly, you can ask questions of your processes as well as your allocation of people and resources. So it's very likely if you're using BigQuery, for example, right? You don't need a team of people managing the data warehouse anymore. So what are they going to focus on? So yeah, those are some other I think side effects of transitioning to a new data warehouse as well. It is definitely about the immediate impact of moving your data and your refactoring reports to operate smoothly within the new data warehouse. But there's this whole halo effect as well. So
Right. Another thing I would say is like think about new opportunities, and by this I mean that stuff that used to live in a Hadoop system might be suitable to migrate into a data warehouse, and there are a number of advantages to that. So first of all, the overhead of managing a data warehouse, like you were saying, is way lower than cloud data warehouse specifically is way lower than the overhead of managing an on-prem data warehouse or an on-prem Hadoop system. And so you can reduce a lot of data ops burden that way. And second, now you have your big data coexisting with your other more traditional business data, and now you can union and merge those data sets together much more easily without having to move data between systems. Also, just having access to simple and scalable SQL semantics can be really valuable if your team is adequately trained with SQL skills.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting because especially with more modern cloud-based data warehouses, your BigQueries, your Snowflakes in particular, there's the ops burden is minuscule. So it's kind of cool because teams of analysts can now just focus on data and queries and things that they're good at versus managing operational burdens and all this stuff, which is probably not in the wheelhouse. So
right. And they still need to think about performance tuning, but hopefully a lot less. The thing you find with all of these systems is that the SQL engines are very, very optimized. And so if you can write reasonably performant SQL, then those systems will squeeze a lot of performance out of your queries. With Hadoop and Spark and other big data technologies in general, it seems like there's a lot more burden of trying to performance tune not only the queries, but the system itself to not overscale, to not underscale, to allocate resources appropriately. So it's really nice to be able to move beyond that and just focus on the data and the business value in that data.
Yeah, well said. Well, cool. I think we covered some good tips for people. So hopefully anyone listening to this, if you're planning to transition your data warehouse, definitely, don't lift and shift, have a plan, develop a cadence, and, prioritize things. I would say just take it one thing at a time. If you have the luxury to do so. I mean, sometimes you may just have to lift and shift, and that's the reality of it. But if you can avoid that, that tends to be better. So
right.
Any final thoughts on that?
Short term, spend a little more money on two systems if you have to, because in the long term, you'll come out way ahead by doing that, I think. So.
Yeah, awesome. Well, cool. All right, well, have a good Monday. We'll chat with you later. So.
Take care.
All right, bye.